I want to show you this Greek inscription I found that forever changed the way that I read Revelation / the Apocalypse of John, last book in your New Testament. And this actually turned into one of my academic publications as well, which is cool. So in this video, I want to show you the inscription, how it changed the way that I read Revelation, what it taught me about these potential communities that John is writing to, and what it taught me about what the author of John is doing in Revelation, specifically in the letters to the 7 churches, which are really famous. It's in Revelation 2 and 3. Before we start, my name is Chris. I have a PhD in Christian origins. On this channel, I talk about the Bible and early Christianity. So if you haven't done so yet, do take a second and subscribe. Okay, so this is the inscription right here. It was found in the western part of Turkey. It's from near an ancient town that was called Magnesia on the Meander, but this is near the present-day Turkish town of Dirmancik. And this stone, even though it doesn't look too fancy, was actually being used in a house, and they found this inscription on this stone, and this happens all the time in like Greece and Turkey and some of these countries. But the really interesting thing is, this inscription is from somebody you've probably heard of before. This inscription is from King Darius. Now, I should probably mention that the King Darius you are familiar with from the book of Daniel is actually probably a literary invention, probably based on this guy. So the actual Darius in the book of Daniel, we have no evidence that such a person ever existed, but that's a good story for a different video. So if you're wondering how an inscription from King Darius can show up in modern-day Turkey, don't forget that before the Greeks, there was a massive empire we call the Achaemenid Empire. It was Persian, and this empire, including King Darius, famously controlled this section of Turkey. So they conquered all of what is modern-day Turkey. In the time period that I study, we usually refer to it as Anatolia or sometimes Asia Minor, and they had regional governments. And this is actually a letter, ostensibly, and we'll talk about whether it's real or not, but this is actually a letter from King Darius to the regional governor of this area, whose name was Gadates or Gadatas. So I laid out the text here. I think it's super interesting. I'm just going to read it, and then I'll show you how it relates to Revelation. This number we just used to catalog inscriptions. So this is from this specific inscription collection, and it's number 109 in this collection. And let's read the English text of this inscription. It says, "This is what the King of Kings, Darius, who is the son of Hystaspes, says to his servant Gadatas. I hear that you do not obey all of my instructions. On the one hand, you work my land, planting the fruit from across the Euphrates in the western part of Asia. I approve of your purpose, and because of these things, great thanks will be ordained to you in the house of the king. However, you are overlooking my disposition on behalf of the gods. If you do not change, I will give you proof of my anger as one who is wronged. Since you have been collecting tribute from the sacred Apollonian gardeners, and you ordered land that was hallowed from my ancestors for divine purpose to be dug up, who spoke to the Persians all certainty," and kind of breaks off there. So even though it sucks that this was broken off, we can actually do quite a lot with this. Now, here's the important puzzle for you. The Achaemenids ruled this area from about 546 to 334 BC. So it was a long time before the time of Revelation, certainly, which is kind of what I opened by teasing. So one of the interesting things about this inscription, though, is this inscription has actually been dated to the 2nd century CE. So why is there this letter from Darius being written in the 2nd century? Now, that is a really interesting question. And here's the answer I found. When you start to look at the sanctuaries in Asia Minor, so the religious, like the religious spaces, we would call them now, the sanctuaries, I found something really interesting, that they keep this kind of stuff. So the sanctuaries would have archives, and often these archives would go back hundreds of years. They might record Persian kings, they might record Greek kings, they even occasionally recorded important Romans, and these sanctuaries would keep records of all of their relationships with these important people throughout history. And often, the records were to show not only that the sanctuary was important, but they had been given some right by some ancient king. So often, for example, if the Romans would come along, somebody in that sanctuary would point and say, oh, look, the Greeks gave us the right, like not to pay taxes or something. So they would use this kind of stuff to fight for their rights. Why am I hearing the Beastie Boys there? But remember, this inscription was carved in the 2nd century CE, which actually leads to a really interesting question, because these sanctuaries would carve and recarve their letters or all these documents from antiquity to prove that they had these rights, to prove how old they were. And when a stone wore out after, 100 or 200 years, they would just recarve it on a new stone. So that's something obviously we can see the sanctuaries doing, but we can also imagine that these sanctuaries may have had some incentive to make this stuff up because it was really awesome to be able to show that you had some ancient king gave you rights. It was a way of proving your legitimacy. You can imagine even people coming into a sanctuary to worship. Imagine going in like the Roman period and seeing stuff from like the Persians and the Greeks and like hundreds of years before. That would definitely add some legitimacy to this sanctuary. So that's the social context of this letter. And for that reason, scholars have asked the question, is this letter a forgery? Because this letter is apparently King Darius writing to his regional satrap and telling him to leave the temple of Apollo alone, or to leave something to do, we don't exactly know, but it's something to do with these Apollonian gardeners. But he's basically accusing his person who's controlling the area of not being cool to these Apollonian gardeners. And it's kind of a stretch, even if you stop and think about the logic of this. Can you really imagine that this king thousands of miles away really gives a crap what his regional satrap does to the sanctuary of Apollo or to these Apollonian gardeners? Probably not. So we have this interesting document that all of a sudden is Darius saying, leave the Apollonian gardeners alone. We don't know who the Apollonian gardeners are. It's kind of it's a weird question. But anyway, we can look at the motivation behind keeping a stone like this and keeping an apparent letter like this, and we can see that there's probably reasons to suspect that this might be a forgery. Now, letters like this were not only from sanctuaries, you can find them in all sorts of places, but one really interesting example, if you look at the book 3 Maccabees, you can see how these types of letters were actually used in literature. And in that book, you get a couple different letters, but one of the most interesting is this letter from Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, apparently expressing remorse for persecuting Jews there. So you can imagine, like, is this real? Is this not? I mean, we probably not, to be honest. But you can see how these letters played an important role in literature. Okay, so what does all that have to do with Revelation? Here is the key. And to do this, I'm going to show you these two inscriptions side by side, and you can almost see the formula jumping off the page, because when the author of Revelation, we usually call him John, when the author of Revelation is composing these letters to the 7 churches, the author of Revelation uses some features that are similar to this inscription and actually just in general, some of these inscriptions from rulers. So let's look at this letter to the church of Thyatira. So this is Revelation 2:18. And to the angel of the church in Thyatira, these are the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your works, your love, faith, service, and endurance. I know that your latest works are greater than the first. But I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet, and is teaching and beguiling my servants to engage in sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to altars. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Beware, I am throwing her on a bed, and those who commit adultery with her I am throwing into great distress, unless they repent of her doings, and I will strike her children dead, and the churches will know that I am the one who searches minds and hearts, and I will give each of you as your works deserve. I'll kind of skip the rest, but the rest is a little bit more about what Jesus says. So when you line these up, it's super interesting to look at this. And we even have this Greek word here, tadelege, which is like thus speaks, basically. So when you line these two up, you can see that they follow a very interesting formula. And remember, Revelation ostensibly is written to these churches in Asia Minor. And Asia Minor is exactly where this decree of Darius, this Magnesian inscription, came from. So we're talking about like the same region. So can you imagine people who are used to seeing these kind of things on the walls of their sanctuaries, people who are used to seeing things laid out like this as decrees from rulers, who all of a sudden get this letter of Revelation and say, I know what that is. You are making the Son of God, in this case, sound like a ruler. Or maybe they wouldn't say that. Maybe they just think, well, this has to be from Jesus because this is how rulers talk. So look at the comparison here when we compare Revelation. How do I explain this? Like, I was very convinced by the structure and the way this is framed. You can see if you agree with me. You don't have to. But we have kind of this similar structure. So here the inscription says, this is what the King of Kings, Darius, who is son of Hystaspes, says to his servant Gadates. Okay. And then in Revelation, we have, these are the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. And you can see I highlighted here the Greek. I highlighted the Greek over here. So this is setting up some kind of command. So here it says, I hear you do not obey all my instructions. So it does have that little bit here, but look at this. You have this really interesting construct of a praise and accusation. You almost might call it like a praise-accusation sandwich. So this says, on the one hand, you work my land, planting fruit from across the Euphrates in the western part of Asia. I approve of your purpose, and because of these things, great thanks will be ordained to you in the house of the king. This one's a little shorter. It says, I know your works, your love, faith, and service, and endurance. I know that your latest works are greater than the first. Okay, so we start with the praise. Then we get to the accusation. However, now this just has This just has a day here as a contrast, and this uses the Greek word alla, which is a stronger, like, but I have this against you. However, you are overlooking my disposition on behalf of my gods. If you do not change, I will give you proof of my anger as one who is wronged, since you have been collecting tribute from the sacred Apollonian gardeners. We already talked about this. This one says, but I have this against you, who tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to engage in sexual immorality. So when I laid these out together and I started to look at these formulaic decrees and how they played in the sanctuaries, I thought, I think that's what the author of Revelation is doing. I think the author of Revelation, in writing these letters from Jesus to the 7 churches, basically draws on some of this formulaic stuff that we have rulers saying. And again, regional similarities, these are the types of things that were inscribed all over Asia Minor. So again, we have this author imagining a letter from Jesus that sounds very much like something that would have been on the walls of the sanctuaries in Asia Minor. And we can imagine for somebody hearing it, that would give it a sense of authenticity. So in 2015, I was living in Berlin. I was a visiting researcher at Humboldt University at the theological faculty in Berlin. And I was doing this research, and I shared some of this research with the professor there. He encouraged me to publish it. And this became, I think it was my second academic publication in the journal Early Christianity. I'll link to the full article below. I hope that was interesting to you. Every time I look at these inscriptions, I find new things. So it's so interesting to do this kind of historical work and then bring it back to the study of early Christianity or the Bible. Do let me know what you think down below. As always, I'd love to know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you have not yet, you can check out my website, cjcarnthwaite.com. Join my mailing list there. I've got it there too. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'll see you next time.